Hi, all. Well, I'm coming to you from Concordia, Irvine East, from Bloomington, Indiana. And I apologize that I've had to even make these videos because they can be kind of painful to watch. I'm noticing that the lighting behind me is not as strong, and so the quality of the video is not as clear as I'd hoped, but it will be something that you can review on your own, and I hope that it helps you as we make our way to the finish line. So without further ado, I'm going to get into the topics that we need to discuss. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to have a video for Pilgrim's Progress Part 2. And then this last section is a separate video called The Modern Self. And we'll finish up Pilgrim's Progress, but we'll talk about the Culpa and all kinds of important topics. Thanks for being patient, and I hope that this does help you. So over the past few weeks, we've been doing some research into the literary periods that are important. If you're going to understand literature, you have to know how people have studied literature and talked about literature for decades and more than a century, really. It is something that developed quite a bit during the late 1800s and early 1900s as people tried to archive literature and figure out how did the classical period become the medieval period, and when did the Renaissance officially begin? So things like that led to the development of literary periods. I don't want to get too carried away with that. You've had some instruction in your self-paced lessons, but I am going to give you the basics of the periods that are most important to us. And I'm going to back up just a little bit. I'm going to talk about where we left off last time after we discussed the context for Pilgrim's Progress. We talked about the Renaissance. We talked about the Enlightenment. And so we'll continue with that today. All right. So Journeying with Christian Part 2 is specifically the second section that you have to read. Now, you're not responsible for reading the entire book. I hope that you have, and I hope you've been understanding that it's basically 40-page sections that you need to read. And so this is specifically referring to Part 2, which is pages 41 to 80. We've talked about how the work of Christ is kind of like at the center of history. If you have a timeline, it's the cross, literally, in the center of history. It's why we refer to BC and AD. Anno Domini is where AD comes from, and that means the year of our Lord. And so, the classical Greek civilization and literature that we've been talking about comes from largely the period before 500 BC, and then 500 BC to 400 BC is known as the Golden Age of Greece. And that's where you have people like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And then Alexander the Great was trained by Aristotle, and he went out to be the conqueror of the world and made the world Greek again. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. So yeah, he spread Greek culture all over the world. After the fall of the Roman Empire in 500 AD, you have the beginning of the Middle Ages, essentially, the Dark Ages, the period in between. And that goes roughly from 500 AD to 1400 AD. And then in 1400 AD, people understand something was happening. After the end of the Black Death and the 100 Years' War, things shifted then. And basically there was great economic development in Italy, and that led to support for the arts. The Medici family is most famous. Lorenzo de' Medici, he is one of the most famous people to patronize the arts, to create ways for people like Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci to create their artwork and not have to worry about bringing home a paycheck other than that. So the work of Christ is central to the change from the pre-Christian to the Christian world. And we see this during the medieval period when the focus was on the church, and we understand that the Renaissance shifted away from the church in some ways, but it would be a long time before Europe was not still focused and anchored in the Christian church. So you have what's basically a pendulum swing. You have the classical period where the focus was on nature, and then you have the medieval period where the focus is on the supernatural, divine providence, focus on the church. And then you have the pendulum swing back, and the focus again was on nature and human beings, and that was the Renaissance. And that continued into the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment basically can be summed up in the figure of one person, Sir Isaac Newton. And you know him as the guy who had an apple fall on him. And he didn't discover gravity, obviously. People understood that there's something holding us to this planet, but he understood the laws of motion. And F equals ma. It's one of those equations we learn in life, kind of like E equals mc squared. Force equals the product of mass times acceleration. So what was Isaac Newton all about? What was his enlightenment, and how was the world enlightened through him? We understand that the period of the Enlightenment was a period of great focus on science and learning. And so one of the things that Newton focused on was observation. And he believed that the world could be understood inductively. That means that you look at things and you understand the laws because of the characteristics of something. You don't have to be taught those things from human teachers. You can learn directly from nature. And the third thing is he believed that science and the study of nature could be used practically. And that basically invented physics as we know it. During this time, you have focus on philosophy and ethics and aesthetics. And so we're going to talk about what those three things have to do with the age of reason, and that's called the Enlightenment. Philosophy. What is true? That is something that we've been trying to figure out through the Bible. And during the Enlightenment, people said, well, God has already revealed himself in nature as well. And so we can learn about God from nature, and we can learn about ourselves from nature, since God created us and created all of nature. So how do we do this? We do it by testing nature. And so, the statement, knowledge is power, it comes from Francis Bacon, who was a thinker during the Renaissance period. Some people actually believe that he wrote Shakespeare's plays, that Shakespeare was a nobody, and it was actually Francis Bacon using somebody else's identity to maybe not get such publicity. And at that time, the theater was looked down upon. So that may be the case. We don't know. But Francis Bacon was a big guy in the Enlightenment, and especially at the beginning. He believed in empiricism, using empirical data to create, to draw conclusions and create meaning, basically. And so his ideas are known as rational skepticism. That means you use reason. That's what rational means. And skepticism, we probably know it means to doubt things. And so you doubt everything that can be doubted. And basically, in the process, you get rid of all the things that are just traditions handed down to us. We doubt the things that are handed down to us, and instead, we find the truth. We find the laws of the universe. Rationalism is a philosophy developed by Descartes, and again, it's this idea of questioning everything that came before, and Descartes boiled it down to, I think, therefore I am, because that's the only thing I know. I know that I think, and that proves my existence, okay? Now, subjectivism was important because it showed that human beings have a way of filtering data, and knowledge depends on individuals. So the point is that we have to, again, question our own assumptions, and we realize that human beings, because of our minds and the way that they have been made, that leads us to be subjects. Okay? Subjects, not in the sense of being a slave to somebody else, but being active, like a subject of a sentence. Now, during this time of the Enlightenment, you have revolutions happening all over the world, on both sides of the Atlantic. And the first revolution actually was the English Revolution, and we don't hear a lot about that, but that's the revolution that is most important if you want to understand Pilgrim's Progress. Pilgrim's Progress, written by John Bunyan, is a byproduct of the English Revolution, and we will discuss that. That happened in the 1600s, 1630 to 1688, essentially. And so that was the earliest revolution. The American Revolution is at the other end of the Enlightenment period. And it involved, obviously, people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, who were important Enlightenment figures. And so the American Revolution in 1776, 1783, that came in the middle. And then the French Revolution in 1789, it was continuing the age of reason in the Enlightenment, but it was also starting to head toward what we call the Romantic Age or Romantic Era. So we've talked about philosophy, and you understand Descartes, and you see that Newton and Bacon were also seeking the truth through empirical science. But now let's talk about ethics. And to do that, we have to discuss a couple of other philosophers. And one is named Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, was a philosopher who believed that government was the only thing keeping people safe in the world, and that people should choose government according to their self-interest. And the thing is, he saw that the world was very chaotic, and so what you do is you choose a government that will take care of law and order. So the most important thing for Hobbes was keeping the demons at bay, and he wrote a book called Leviathan. And Leviathan it's basically all about how a ruler needs to have a firm hand and make sure that people don't break the law. So that's Thomas Hobbes. The idea that he started, though, was that the people have a social contract with their ruler. It's a contract. They don't sign it on paper exactly, but they accept their ruler because their ruler keeps the peace. So, again, Thomas Hobbes, he wrote this book called Leviathan. Leviathan is actually a name for a creature in the Bible. Some people connect it to like Jonah's whale or fish, whatever ate Jonah. You can see the picture on the screen if you look at your PowerPoint. And so basically this is using your reason, you embrace your ruler because your ruler will help you survive in this very chaotic world. But this idea that government is an agreement between individuals and the ruler, it didn't mean that he wanted people to democratically elect their rulers. He believed in monarchy. But he also accepted that the people need to consent to allow their monarch to rule them, which he thought was the most reasonable thing to do. Another philosopher who studied ethics, who studied what it means to get along in this world and to do the right thing in this world. The other philosopher we need to talk about is John Locke. John Locke took Hobbes's idea and ran with it, and he believed that rulers only rule because of the consent of the governed, and that the people have rights. There are rights of man or human beings, and we naturally have freedom, and we are naturally equal, and we are naturally subject to God alone. And no natural human authority can take away that freedom. But sometimes people give up their freedom to the governing authority. But if the ruler is not a good ruler, then the people are justified in overthrowing the government. If the government doesn't protect their rights, they can have a revolution. And so John Locke is seen as one of the main founding fathers or forerunners of the American Revolution, and he believed in life, liberty, and property as protected by the government. Okay, he's a little different from Thomas Jefferson, who believed in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, what is ethics? Ethics is the good. If philosophy is the true, then ethics is the good in this world. And again, using their reason, people wanted to determine what this means. And, one thing that we need to understand is during the period that Locke was writing in, the Industrial Revolution was taking off. In addition, you have a movement toward urbanization where people are moving to cities. And so what does this mean? How can we get along with the environment? How can we get along with each other in these new changed circumstances? Technology improved people's life. Okay, from 1750 on, you have an incredible rise in Europe's population because medicine and science were being developed. It's a fascinating thing. On the other hand, there was a deterioration of the quality of life as people moved to the cities because that's the only place that they could survive. In addition, during this age of reason, you have bloody religious wars. Including that English Civil War. And, the people who lived during this time, they looked around and they saw people fighting over religion. And that was one reason they turned away from religion. They focused on this life, not the afterlife. And they realized that everything that we do is, we try to survive in this world. And so rationalists, again, they were governed by their reason. Empiricists, scientists, were governed by their senses and the testing of nature. So that was how they determined what was good for people in this world. So what was Enlightenment religion? Well, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and others, they believed in Deism. They believed in individual liberty. And they also believed that every person had a right to go and read the Bible themselves. This goes back to Martin Luther. But Martin Luther didn't say it was a free-for-all, that everybody could interpret the Bible in their own way. But people like Thomas Jefferson did believe this, and he actually created his own Bible called the Jefferson Bible, and it took out all the miracles in Scripture. But the main thing was that people had new authority individually. They didn't need to go to a priest or go to church to have access to Scripture. They also believed that since God reveals himself through nature, that we can just rely on that. Let's rely only on what we can determine through nature and what can be tested. So things like miracles, they can't be tested. So Thomas Jefferson and the Deists, they opposed superstition, fanaticism, which is based on a lot of emotion. Sports fans are sports fanatics, right? They are emotional about their team, even if their team is flawed. Jefferson and others opposed supernaturalism as well. They opposed the idea that you could have anything apart from nature. And so that's why he changed the Bible the way he did. So there were two things going on during the Enlightenment. Deism, which is a belief in God as a kind of divine watchmaker. He made this beautiful universe like a watch, and it's very intricate, and there are many pieces, many moving parts. But he, like a watchmaker, he wound it up, and then he let it go. And he gave it to people, and then he removed himself from the universe, essentially, and is not active as we hear in the Bible. That was what deists believe. They reject anything that was supernatural intervention. On the other hand, you have people like Voltaire, who was another leading figure along with Jefferson during the Enlightenment. And he basically said there is no God. One of the reasons that people shifted away from God during this time was the events that they saw in the world, and one of those was an incredibly strong earthquake in Lisbon, Portugal in 1755. It was an event that devastated the city, that killed tens and tens of thousands of people, and it left people trying to figure out why God would allow such a disaster to happen. Then some church people tried to explain that, it must have been because of something bad that those people did. This is very similar to what people were doing during the Hurricane Katrina and other disasters. They have tried to say, well, God must have allowed that because of the bad things that those people have done. And that's frankly an abomination, and we should fight against people who are trying to play God to understand situations that way. And that's kind of what was happening, and what it led to is people rejecting God altogether. So we've talked about philosophy, which is the true. We've talked about ethics, which is the good. And now we talk about aesthetics, which is the beautiful. And the idea here is that during the Age of Reason, people were trying to understand why some things seem beautiful to us. Well, first of all, the senses used for science were leading to a lot of factual information. And so we understand that beautiful things come to us through our senses. So people develop their theories based on the senses. We can appreciate art in an abstract sense. We don't have to see it to understand that it's beautiful. Immanuel Kant is one of the most famous philosophers to explore this idea of what's beautiful and why is it beautiful. So, the main thing is that believing that art can be systematic and rational and ordered, it just fits with the Enlightenment period. And it also helps us understand that beauty isn't just beautiful because we get something out of it. That would be very selfish of us. We understand that beauty can have an identity outside of what people get from it. That matches up with what we understand about God. And when we say God is beautiful, it's not because he gives us things. It's because he is beautiful. So what was happening in literature during the time of the Enlightenment? We've already talked about Pilgrim's Progress at the front end or earliest end of the Enlightenment in the 1660s and 1670s. But we now need to see that during the 18th century, the 1700s, the novel was becoming the form of literature that people participated in most. And the first official novel is Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. It used to be said that if your family could purchase one book, because they were so precious, if they could purchase one book, it would be the Bible. If they could purchase two books, it would be the Bible and Pilgrim's Progress. If they could purchase three books, it would be the Bible, Pilgrim's Progress, and Robinson Crusoe at this time. Audiences were learning how to read through more schooling and systematic education. And so because you had a larger audience that could read, more people had access to texts and they could buy those texts. The system of patronage that was established during the Renaissance, that stopped. It wasn't as necessary because people could buy directly from the creators, and the creators could make money from the sales of their art. And so literature was something that was equalizing. It was egalitarian. And through literature, you could experience other people's lives, and you could see your own life reflected in that literature. Some of the literature at this time, though, was sensationalized. It was, stories were told because they were melodramatic and adventure stories like Robinson Crusoe. But there is a lot of truth in these stories as well. So the novel was becoming the form of literature that people were reading in the 1700s, on into the 1800s and 1900s, and all the way to today. This rise of the novel included people like Defoe, and it also included women who were finding their own place in this society, and some were speaking up for equal treatment for women. Mary Shelley's mother, we talked about earlier, Mary Wollstonecraft, she was one of the first feminists who believed that women and men should be equal at this same time that Thomas Jefferson was writing about equality and all people being equal. Another novelist we need to know besides Daniel Defoe is Jane Austen. And Jane Austen, you can see some of her books on the slide there. She's maybe most known for Pride and Prejudice. In addition, you have Mary Shelley, the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, and she wrote Frankenstein, taking the ball and running with it, writing one of the first science fiction stories and a very influential novel. In addition, you have satires that were written. Because this is the age of reason, people are using their brains to write literature and to read literature. And so a lot of the literature at this time, it's very deep. You have to read it carefully, and you have to know what's going on outside of the novel in politics to understand the satire. So people like Jonathan Swift, Samuel Johnson, and Voltaire, they were writing satires. They often wrote about a hero who goes on a journey in search of the meaning of life. And the hero often comes across people who just don't make sense. And those people often represent others in the world who are trying to tell us what the meaning of life is. Maybe they are from the government or from the church, or just foolish people who don't really understand the meaning of life, but they keep doing things the way they've always done them. So the 18th century was the rise of the novel as an art form. Now I want to talk as quickly as I can about the English Revolution that provides the backdrop to A Pilgrim's Progress. Again, we're talking about the period of the 1600s, and this is after Queen Elizabeth I has died. She was basically a patron for Shakespeare, and then her successor was James I. Shakespeare also wrote for James I. James I had an extravagant lifestyle. He was gambling, he was hunting, he was writing about witchcraft. He was just a very interesting, colorful person. In addition, he sponsored the official version of the Bible that we know as the King James Bible. He was frustrated with Parliament and Parliament not wanting to give him the money that he asked for. He believed that he had a divine right as the king, that he was put in place by God, and the Parliament should not go against him. Well, his son had the same lifestyle, and he believed in the divine right of kings as well, but he wasn't going to tolerate Parliament anymore. And finally, there was such tension that it reached a breaking point. And part of this happened because Charles I, he was supposed to be a Protestant king after Elizabeth was a Protestant and James was a Protestant. Charles kind of moved back toward Roman Catholicism by marrying a Catholic, and he was still in the Church of England, but the Church of England was becoming more and more Catholic. And that led to a revolution in Parliament by the people who were who wanted to continue the Reformation and be apart from the Roman Catholic Church. And those were called the Puritans. There were some Puritans who came to the United States and settled in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that's where we got the Salem witch trials. They were kind of extreme, but they wanted to be different from the Roman Catholic Church. So I'm going to try and make this long story very short. You just need to know that this was a collision that was bound to happen because Charles wanted to have his power and Parliament wanted to have its power. And so finally in 1640, Charles summoned Parliament because he needed more money, but they were very hostile to him because basically he had disbanded the previous Parliament because he was so sick of them. And that Parliament accused Charles's council of treason. It passed the Triennial Act, which meant that Parliament had to be called once every 3 years. And if it wasn't called by the king, that it could assemble on its own. And there was further concern about Charles's strict interpretation of his faith, kind of leaning toward Roman Catholicism in his Anglicanism. Finally, you can see that civil war was inevitable, and the royalists were the people on the side of the king, and they were also known as Cavaliers. The people who were supporting the Puritans' Parliament were called the Roundheads, and so this was a civil war between the Cavaliers and the Roundheads, the Royalists and the Puritans, or the Parliament. And so in 1642, the Royalists were winning. It looked like this would be a short civil war, but then the tide turned. Part of that comes from the fact that Ireland is Catholic, and there were uprisings in Ireland and also in Scotland in support of Charles. But then they eventually were put down, and so that's why the tide turned. In 1646, Charles was imprisoned, he was tried by Parliament, and he was finally even executed. Kind of an incredible thing to think about, long before the French Revolution and the bloody guillotine. So what happened is the commander of the parliamentary forces, Oliver Cromwell, he basically established himself as a dictator after 1646. And so, the country went from having a king to having a dictator. It's really hard to say which was better and which was worse. So his first job was to quell uprisings. Those uprisings were eventually put down. Ireland rebelled, Scotland rebelled, but both of those pro-royalist uprisings, they were both put down. So this story is not going to end happily. And Oliver Cromwell, he's a dictator. He won the Civil War in 1651, at least the first part of the Civil War. He was dictator until 1658, but then his son took over. So it's just like he's a king, and his son was not an effective leader. Meanwhile, Charles I had a son named Charles II, and Charles II, in exile, he was restored to the throne in 1660. That's known as the Restoration, and some people actually make this a separate literary period. But we're not getting into that. Just know after Charles II came Charles II's son, James II, and there was continuing unrest. So people were not happy. They weren't happy with the Puritans running the country. They weren't happy with the royal family running the country. Finally, there was a glorious revolution in 1687, and this was actually a bloodless revolution, and it was the establishment of William and Mary as the monarchs of England, and it basically ended the rebellion because it was a very Protestant king and queen that made it different. And so in the middle of all this comes John Bunyan. John Bunyan was a tinker. Okay, we know about people who like to tinker with things. A tinker was someone who fixed pots. And so he did the same job as his father. He was an itinerant worker. He went around to find people's pots to fix. And he also became a Christian. This largely came out of his experience in the Civil War, and he saw the destruction, and it gave him a religious experience. And he was an unlicensed itinerant preacher roaming around. And finally in 1660, he was imprisoned because the government didn't want itinerant preachers, especially when they weren't members or preachers who had been officially appointed by the government. That's how it worked. The Church of England really was the Church of England controlled by the government. And so he spent time, 12 years, in Bedford County Jail. And it was during his time in prison that he wrote Pilgrim's Progress. Now, he didn't agree with the Puritan Parliament, and he didn't agree with the royal family opposition. And so he was a nonconformist. That's what we call him. So as we look at this revolution and we realize that over time, people were moving from Thomas Hobbes to John Locke and realizing that average people should have a say in their own government. And if their rulers are not giving them freedom, they should have a revolution. There was another man named JeanJacques Rousseau. He is a figure in this period who basically said, human beings are born free, but everywhere in the world they are in chains. And he realized that people are in chains because of bad governments. He is considered the father of Romanticism, where Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, kind of following philosophy and science. Rousseau said, I feel, therefore I am. And the Romantic period is seen as a very emotional time where people fought for their rights, and sometimes things became very irrational and very destructive. So now we've moved from the Enlightenment period into the age of Romanticism. And Romanticism, based on the ideas of Rousseau in his book Emile, which is about a student who's, again, innocent and is trained in seeking after freedom. And again, Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed that revolution was natural if people were in chains, because people should not be naturally in chains. And so there were social and cultural revolutions, there were political revolutions, and this goes along with the science and industrial revolution that was happening from 1750 onward. Basically, we can say that the first half of the 1800s were the Romantic era, and then the second half of the 1800s we call the Victorian period. And it's because of Queen Victoria, who ruled from 1837 to 1901, 64 years. She was only just recently passed by Elizabeth II as the longest reigning monarch in England's history. She also became the Empress of India in 1876 as a part of Great Britain's desire to colonize the world and rule the oceans. So the British Empire became the empire on which the sun never set. And that meant two things. First, that it would never fail. And second, that literally they owned colonies all the way around the world. And so the sun, as it went around the world, it never set on the empire. The Victorian period is also known for the manners, morals, and missions of Queen Victoria. Obviously, we think of something being Victorian if it's very proper, if it's very civilized, maybe we could say. But there's also an element of wanting to make the world Christian and sending out missionaries all over the world. During this time, the Victorian era, you have realism, naturalism, and you also have more romanticism and the Gothic literature, like books such as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Dracula come in the late Victorian period. So even though you have a lot of emphasis on realistic fiction, you also have these ghost stories that remain a part of our way of communicating through literature. So some of the most famous works of literature come from this Victorian period. Charles Dickens was a Victorian writer. The Victorian period had to respond to all of the upheaval created by the Industrial Revolution and also all the political changes throughout the world. So there was upheaval that was social, economic, and political that Queen Victoria had to deal with. Sometimes she got caught in the middle of everything, and people would boo and hiss when they saw her because of the changes. People were speaking out against their government and were becoming more confident that they were actually the real rulers of their countries. So I hope this gives you a little bit of context for world literature, but also for Pilgrim's Progress, the second book that we study in this course. You have to know that John Bunyan was writing to a world that was going through radical changes. And the same can be said for other authors at other times, like Charles Dickens, or F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote during a later time called the Modernist period after World War I. And we'll discuss him in the next video.